Now let's look at impact of taxes, additional taxes on certain goods, and impact of subsidy on certain goods and industries. How do they impact the competitive behavior of price and quantity? Like how much quantity will be now supplied if you add an additional tax for this item, or you provide a subsidy for this item. So let's look at it again from our famous price quantity chart. So let's assume this is our demand curve and this is our supply curve. Yeah, and let's draw equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Let's again draw what we always do, which is we draw the consumer surplus. This is the clearing price quantity. Consumer surplus in blue is this, before taxes being added, and producer surplus is this area. Now let's imagine that government says I'm going to add tax T for this specific industry, T per unit. So it's going to say, hey, I'm going to add, let's say, $1 tax, which is one for every unit that's sold. So someone has to pay this price, yeah? And depending on the elasticity of demand or supply, which one is more inelastic, we will see who pays for it more compared to the other one. Is the consumer going to pay this $1 tax, or is the producer going to pay? So let's imagine they split it in half. So how would they do it? You would then have to draw this $1, a vertical line that's exactly equal to $1, and you get this part. Yeah? So this is that $1. So your P0 price went up. Yeah? Your quantity also went down. Yeah? We see a reduction in quantity for this tax that got added, and we also see that this area, which the producers and consumers enjoyed, in this case this was initially this was enjoyed by the consumer and this was enjoyed by the producer, is going to go away because there is a tax added. So this goes away. Yeah? And we'll have to redraw this as this. Yeah? So this consumers just lost this area, let's call it B consistently. Consumers lost delta C is minus B, and we see producers also lost, in this case we will call it delta C. So this is, let's say, the C triangle. So this triangle was lost by the producers, and this triangle was lost, triangle D was lost by the consumers. Yeah? So this already added as the deadweight, meaning overall the country lost B and C. I mean, they could have, either producer or consumer would have enjoyed it, but at the same time, when this price went up, the consumer also lost this area, because now this is the clearing price, and that intersects the demand curve here. So this whole area is also going to be lost by the producer and the consumer, and likewise this whole area will be lost by the producer. Yeah? So we have to get that out. So we see how consumers also lost, and we see how producers also lost. Yeah? So let's call this A. So consumer lost this rectangle A as well, so minus A, and producers also lost, we'll call it D in this case, minus D. Yeah? So consumers lost big time, producers also lost big time. But the government, with this $1 tax that got added, it actually is going to make that much money. So government makes up A and D. So the government would be plus A and plus D. So the net dead weight is minus B and minus C. Yeah, this cancels out. So consumers lost A to the government, producers lost D to the government, and the country overall for this industry lost B and C, meaning they're just producing less where there was a demand, but those people are no longer going to buy that quantity, yeah, because it's not available at that price, which was lower. Now the price has gone up. So this $1 tax has this impact. Similarly, the government can also say, hey, I'm going to provide you a subsidy. And so the subsidy is exactly the opposite. It's the negative tax in some sense. The government would say, hey, I'm going to give you this $1 tax rebate for every car that you sell, or every pound of wheat that you sell. And so then what would happen is, this would shift this whole curve, yeah? Instead of A and D losing, B and C losing, you can start to plot this in a different way. And then now this is going to be the equilibrium point. So you see how consumer surplus, producer surplus now increases if we now provide a subsidy, meaning it's okay to have a higher clearing price, and so the quantity will also go up because of subsidy, yeah? And there will be this artificial price hike, which is then subsidized by the government, and depending on the inelasticity of the demand curve or the inelasticity of the supply curve, either of the producer or the consumer would lose more. So let's look at that briefly. So like we did for taxes, you can do the same for subsidy. But now let's look at, like, in this case we assumed both producer and consumer lose in the same proportion to the government and to dead weight. But that could be, imagine there is a highly inelastic demand curve, meaning, you know, the good that you have is really needed, and there is very little chance that consumers are going to reduce intake. Let's say this demand curve is this, and your supply curve is like highly elastic, relatively elastic. So in this case, if you start to see the clearing price was this, yeah, P0, Q0, and with $1 tax, let's assume this is that $1 tax. We start to see that that's going to be something like this, yeah? And we see that now producers and consumers have a very different area that they're giving up. Producers are giving up much less to the government versus consumers are giving up much higher to the government. Why? Because the demand is highly inelastic. Similarly, if you make the supply highly inelastic, you will see the producers are going to give up much more to the government in taxes than the consumers. So that shows you how, if there is supply side that's inelastic versus demand side that's inelastic, different constituents would lose different amount of money. So if you were to draw now highly inelastic supply curve, let's say this is your supply curve, and your demand curve is like relatively elastic, and the equilibrium price and quantity was this, and then you added $1 tax, which would look like this. And so now what we see is that your consumers and your producers are going to lose in different quantities. So producers and consumers, this is what's going to be the loss to the government for this new price from consumer side, but this area is going to be the loss now from producer side. So in this case, because of highly inelastic supply side characteristics that your company enjoys, the competitive intensity makes you lose much more as the producer versus the consumer, because they're highly elastic on the demand side. So with this, we understand how taxes impact reduction in quantity, increase in price, loss of producer and consumer surplus. Subsidy does the exact opposite, and it changes based on like which side is highly inelastic. If the supply is highly inelastic, the suppliers are going to suffer more, meaning they're going to pay more to the government of their surplus that they initially enjoyed back to the government. But if the demand side is highly inelastic, then the consumers are going to pay more to the government in terms of that additional tax burden that goes there. So super important to know which side, what kind of elasticity your product enjoys to really determine what's going to be the impact on quantity and what's going to be the impact on price that you will have to bear.